For months, the Trump administration called the Hong Kong unrest an internal matter for China. With tensions already high between the United States and China, the White House decided to play it cool. Even when American figures like Nancy Pelosi offered words of support for a peaceful resolution, the White House preferred not to get involved in the issue until August, 3 months after the protests first broke out in Hong Kong. With the protests lingering, the U.S. president began to link the peaceful handling of the demonstrations to a trade deal with China, trying to use the case as a bargaining chip in its trade talks.
No, I think it would be very hard to deal if they do violence. I mean, if it's another Tiananmen Square, I think it's a very hard thing to do if there's violence. And, that I'm president, but that's a little beyond me because I think there'd be tremendous political sentiment not to do something.
4 days before those remarks, Trump tweeted, "Of course China wants to make a deal. Let them work humanely with Hong Kong first." After Trump's warning to Beijing, his administration's tone changed in carefully chosen words, tying the Hong Kong issue to a trade deal. Echoing Trump's words in a speech in Detroit, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence warned that China will not get a U.S. trade deal unless it honors its 1984 commitments to Hong Kong.
We're in the midst of productive discussions with China, and they'll continue in the weeks ahead. But for the United States to make a deal with China, Beijing needs to honor its commitments, beginning with the commitment China made in 1984 to respect the integrity of Hong Kong's laws through the Sino-British Joint Declaration. As the President said yesterday, it'll be much harder for us to make a deal if something violent happens in Hong Kong. And I want to assure you, our administration will continue to urge Beijing to act in a humanitarian manner and urge China and the demonstrators in Hong Kong to resolve their differences peaceably.
In an interview with Fox News, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also linked Hong Kong to trade in an even more explicit way.
Yes, look, with respect to Huawei, this administration has taken actions that no previous administration was prepared to take. President Trump's done the same thing on trade. We understand the challenges that China presents. We've asked them multiple times just to honor their word. We've talked about that in Hong Kong, right? They have to honor what they promised the Hong Kong people. They made a commitment that they wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. They've made promises about human rights. The activities that are taking place in the western provinces in China are of an enormous scale of human rights violations. When we try to negotiate a trade agreement with them, we've tried to put in processes that ensure we have the opportunity to verify, because we need to make sure that we don't suffer from China breaking a promise or have to watch Chinese disinformation about the agreement that's entered into.
While this flip-flop might appear confusing at first, experts say it is typical of Washington's behavior. They say when the trade talks are going well, Washington is content to stay out of China's internal affairs. But when the talks run into trouble, it tries to drag the Hong Kong issue into the trade negotiations as leverage for its own trade purposes. Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 after 155 years of British rule. The transfer of sovereignty is known commonly as the handover, when then Chinese President Jiang Zemin, the last colonial governor Chris Patten, Prince Charles, then British Prime Minister Tony Blair attended the ceremony. The affairs of Hong Kong are part of China's internal affairs. China's government is entitled to exercise sovereignty over Hong Kong in accordance with the country's constitution and the basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and it is entitled to do so without interference by external forces. Beijing has consistently advocated that unrelated issues should not be dragged into the trade talks.
香港事务纯属中国内政。我们注意到，特朗普总统此前曾经表示过，香港是中国的一部分，他们必须自己解决，不需要建议。我们希望美方能够说到做到。
Experts say by accusing China of wriggling out of its commitment to preserve Hong Kong's separate political system, The White House is trying to sell this argument that a trade deal with Beijing must have strict enforcement provisions.
The United States shares the concern of many in Hong Kong that the lack of procedural protections in the proposed amendments could undermine Hong Kong's autonomy and negatively impact the territory's long-standing protections of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democratic values, as enshrined in the Basic Law and the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
Eswar Parasad believes that showing support for a peaceful resolution of the situation in Hong Kong could potentially give the U.S. a stronger hand in trade negotiations, under the assumptions that Beijing wants a trade deal badly enough and wants to maintain Hong Kong's special status in its trade with the U.S. Some analysts are skeptical of the efficacy of using the Hong Kong case as leverage in U.S.-China trade talks. They say Trump's threats of backing away from a trade deal carried no weight in China. Hu Zhijian, the editor-in-chief of China's state-run Global Times newspaper, wrote on Twitter that as for Washington's threat to link trade talks with the situation in Hong Kong, what I heard on various occasions is scorn on this idea. China is making arrangements on scenario of no deal. The U.S. and China have been going tit for tat on billions of dollars in tariffs for months. Meanwhile, with no trade deals on the horizon, China hawks in the Trump administration have pushed Trump to move ahead on separate issues to put more pressure on the Chinese. That includes the sale of 66 F-16 fighter jets to the self-governing island of Taiwan. The $8 billion deal is the largest or one of the largest arms sales for the United States to Taiwan. While experts argue that the Hong Kong leverage would not work against China, there is at least one person who is sure the U.S. president has affected the situation on the ground in Hong Kong by linking the case to his trade war, Trump himself.
I think if it weren't for the trade talks, Hong Kong would be in much bigger trouble. I think it would have been much more violent. I really believe China wants to make a deal, and they know it puts us in a very bad position if there's not a humane way of handling the problems. And I've let them know that, look, handle it in a humane fashion. And we'll see. But I do believe that because of what I'm doing with trade, that's very much keeping down the temperature in Hong Kong.
The Chinese economy, however, has already taken a major hit, which in the end limits Washington's influence in Hong Kong. In the words of Harvard Kennedy School fellow Shirley Yu, from Beijing's perspective, the U.S.'s tariffs on the variety of Chinese goods. The U.S. blacklisted Huawei and other tech companies. The U.S. named China a currency manipulator. How many more economic sanctions can the U.S. enact onto China after what's been done already? Beijing won't be too much worse off and won't be better off, no matter what Beijing decides to do with Hong Kong. Trump's decision to maximize pressure on Beijing seems only to meet more resistance, leaving the odds of reaching a trade deal with the Chinese close to zero. With the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China around the corner, the Chinese leadership could use this opportunity to remind people of the history of foreign powers meddling in Chinese affairs and tell people to unite against the bullying Americans.
需要指出的是，这次阅兵是庆祝新中国成立70周年活动的重要组成部分，不针对任何国家和地区，不针对任何特定事态。中国军队始终是维护世界和平和地区稳定的坚定力量，致力于维护世界和平，服务构建人类命运共同体的崇高事业，同时有决心、有能力，坚决维护国家主权、安全和发展利益，捍卫和促进世界和平稳定。
心情很激动啊，因为这个也是难忘的时刻。
China has constantly reminded Washington that any attempt to use the Hong Kong issue as a bargaining chip will not succeed.